The first snow of December had begun falling over Hogwarts just after dinner, and by the time the students had finished their evening classes, the castle grounds were transformed into a pristine, white landscape that seemed to glow under the light of the waxing moon. Most students had hurried back to their common rooms, eager for warmth and the comfort of fires and friends. But three students lingered in the entrance hall, watching the snow through the great oak door. Marcus Thornfield stood with his arms crossed, his Ravenclaw scarf wrapped loosely around his neck, his dark eyes tracking the path of individual snowflakes as they spiraled down from the night sky. He was a sixth year, tall and quiet, the kind of student who always sat in the back of classes, but somehow always knew the answers when called upon. His mind worked in patterns and puzzles, seeing connections that others missed, which made him excellent at ancient runes, but sometimes difficult to have a simple conversation with. Beside him, bouncing slightly on the balls of her feet to keep warm, was Ivy Greengrass, a fifth year Hufflepuff with honey colored hair that she kept perpetually pulled back in a practical braid. She was distantly related to the Greengrass family that had produced Daphne and Astoria, but unlike her more reserved cousins, Ivy was all energy and enthusiasm. She had a talent for herbology that Professor Longbottom said was remarkable, and the habit of talking to plants as if they were close personal friends. The third member of their unlikely trio was Finn Blackburn, a fourth year Gryffindor, who looked younger than his age, with a shock of red hair that rivaled the Weasleys, and a dusting of freckles across his nose. He had transferred to Hogwarts from a small magical school in Ireland 2 years ago, and still sometimes got lost in the castle's endless corridors. He was hopeless at potions, but had a natural gift for charms that made even Professor Flitwick take notice. The three of them had met by accident during a study session in the library last year, each working on separate assignments at the same table because everywhere else had been full. They had discovered over the course of that evening that they worked well together, their different strengths complementing each other in unexpected ways. Marcus could work through the theoretical problems. Ivy could find creative, practical applications. And Finn could explain things in a way that made even the most complex magic feel accessible and fun. Since then, they had fallen into an easy friendship, studying together, exploring the castle together, and occasionally getting into minor trouble together, though never anything serious. They respected the rules mostly, but they also believed that Hogwarts was meant to be explored, its secrets meant to be discovered by those curious enough to look. Do you think it's true? Ivy asked, breaking the comfortable silence. The story about the Winter Garden? Marcus tilted his head, considering. Professor Binns mentioned something about it once, during a lecture on the founding of Hogwarts, but you know how he is. Everything blurs together into endless dates and treaties. I remember something about Helga Hufflepuff creating a space for students to find peace during harsh winters. My great aunt told me about it, Finn said, his Irish accent softening his words. She went to Hogwarts in the 70s, said she stumbled into it during her fourth year when she was feeling homesick around Christmas. She described it as a garden that never freezes, always blooming, always warm. She said it saved her that year, gave her a place to remember that spring always comes, even in the darkest winter. Evie turned to look at him with interest. Did she say where it was? Finn shook his head. She said it only appears to those who need it, that you can't find it by looking, only by being ready to receive what it offers. That sounds like typical magical nonsense, Marcus said, but there was no malice in his voice, only affection for the way magic worked in such infuriatingly vague ways. Everything worthwhile in this castle is hidden behind riddles and conditions. Why can't anything just have a door and a sign? Because that would be boring, Ivy said, grinning, and because magic responds to intention and emotion. The castle knows what we need, sometimes before we do. Professor Longbottom told me that once. He said Hogwarts is alive in ways that people don't fully understand. They stood quietly for a moment, watching the snow continue to fall. The grounds looked like something from a fairy tale. The forbidden forest, a dark smudge on the horizon. The frozen lake, a smooth sheet of silver. The castle itself rising behind them with its countless towers and turrets, its endless windows glowing with warm light. I miss the garden at home, Ivy said softly. This time of year, everything is dormant, sleeping. I know it's natural that the plants need their rest, but I miss the green. I miss the feeling of things growing. I miss the sound of rain on my window, Finn added. It rains differently in Ireland. Softer somehow, more patient. Here, the rain feels harsher, like it's in a hurry to be somewhere else. Marcus was quiet for a longer moment before speaking. I miss the bookshop near my house. The owner knew me by name. She always had recommendations. Here, the library is incredible, but it's so vast that sometimes I feel lost in it. I miss the feeling of a small space filled with carefully chosen books. The admission hung in the air between them, a rare moment of vulnerability from Marcus, who usually kept his emotions carefully contained. Ivy reached out and squeezed his arm gently. Maybe, she said thoughtfully. We're ready. Ready for what? Finn asked. To find the winter garden. We're all missing something. We're all looking for comfort. If the stories are true, if it only appears to those who need it, then maybe tonight is the night. Marcos looked skeptical but intrigued. And how exactly do you propose? We find something that doesn't want to be found. We don't find it, Ivy said simply. We let it find us. We walk, we stay open, and we trust that the castle knows what we need. That's a terrible plan, Marcus said. It's a perfect plan, Finn countered, already moving toward the corridor that led deeper into the castle. Come on, what's the worst that could happen? We wander around for an hour, don't find anything, and go back to our common rooms. At least we'll have tried. Marcus sighed but followed, and Ivy grinned, pleased that her impulsive suggestion was being taken seriously. They walked together through the quiet corridors, their footsteps echoing softly against the stone floors. The portraits on the walls watched them pass with varying degrees of interest. An old wizard asked where they were going at such an hour, and Ivy told him they were looking for something lost, which seemed to satisfy him. They passed the entrance to the kitchens, where the house elves would be cleaning up from dinner. They passed the staircase that led down to the dungeons, where the Slytherins were probably gathered in their common room, warm and comfortable beneath the lake. They passed a window that looked out onto the snowy grounds, and paused for a moment to watch a small fox trot across the pristine white surface, leaving delicate tracks behind. The castle felt different at night, more intimate somehow, as if it were sharing secrets that it kept hidden during the busy daylight hours. The torches burned lower, casting longer shadows. The armor stood silent and watchful. Even the ghosts seemed quieter, drifting past with solemn nods rather than their usual chatter. After 20 minutes of wandering, Marcus spoke up. I don't think this is working. We're just walking in circles. Maybe we're trying too hard, Finn suggested. Maybe we need to stop searching and start just being. That's even more vague than Ivy's original plan, Marcus said, but there was a hint of amusement in his voice. They found themselves in a corridor they didn't immediately recognize, which wasn't unusual at Hogwarts. The castle had a way of rearranging itself, or perhaps it was just so vast that even students who had been there for years still discovered new passages and rooms. This particular corridor was narrower than most, with older stonework that suggested it was part of the original castle construction. There were fewer portraits here, and the ones that did hang on the walls appeared to be very old, their subjects dressed in the style of the medieval period. One painting showed a woman in a yellow gown with her hands outstretched, as if offering something to the viewer, though the paint was too faded to see what it might have been. Wait, Ivy said, stopping suddenly. Do you smell that? The three of them stood still, breathing deeply. Beneath the usual castle smells of stone and torch smoke and ancient magic, there was something else. Something green and growing, with a hint of sweetness that reminded Ivy of honeysuckle. Marcos of the jasmine that grew in his mother's window box, and Finn of the wild roses that climbed the walls of his childhood home in County Cork. It's coming from down there, Finn said, pointing to a small archway they might have missed if they hadn't been paying attention. It was partially hidden behind a suit of armor that looked like it hadn't moved in centuries. They exchanged glances, a mixture of excitement and nervousness passing between them. Then, without needing to discuss it, they moved forward together, carefully edging past the armor and through the archway. Beyond was a short passage, no more than 15 feet long, that ended in a wooden door. The door was old but beautifully maintained, made of dark oak with iron fittings that had been worked into the shapes of leaves and vines. There was no lock, no handle, and just a smooth surface that seemed to invite a gentle push. Marcus reached out and laid his palm flat against the wood. It was warm to the touch, warmer than any door had a right to be in the middle of winter. He felt a gentle pulse beneath his hand, like heartbeat, slow and steady and welcoming. I think it knows we're here, he said quietly. Then let's not keep it waiting, Ivy said, and she pushed. The door swung open silently and warmth spilled out to meet them, carrying with it the scent of growing things, of earth and flowers, and the particular green smell of plants in their full health. The three students stepped through together and found themselves standing in a garden that should not have been possible. The room, if it could be called a room, was enormous. The ceiling soared high above them, but instead of stone or wood, it appeared to be made of glass or crystal, perfectly clear, showing the night sky and the falling snow beyond. Yet inside, the temperature was perfect, warm without being hot, comfortable without being stifling. The air itself seemed alive, gently circulating, carrying different scents as it moved. The garden was arranged in a series of terraced levels, with stone pathways winding between beds of flowering plants, shrubs, and small trees. Everything was in bloom, impossibly, magnificently in bloom. Roses climbed trellises in shades of red and pink and yellow and white. Lavender spilled over the edges of raised beds, its purple flowers vivid against silvery green foliage. There were plants Ivy recognized from her herbology studies, dittany and fluxweed and valerian, but there were also flowers she had never seen before, magical varieties that seemed to glow from within with their own soft light. In the center of the garden was a fountain, its water clear and bright, flowing in patterns that seemed to defy gravity, arcing and swirling in ways that water shouldn't be able to move. The sound it made was musical, not quite bells, not quite singing, but something between the two that was immediately soothing. Around the fountain were several benches made of smooth stone, and tucked into various corners of the garden were small reading nooks with comfortable chairs and tables. A few lamps hung from posts along the pathways, their light warm and steady, not flickering like torches, but burning with the same constancy as the sun. This is impossible, Marcos breathed, but he was smiling as he said it, a genuine smile of wonder that his friends rarely saw. This is absolutely impossible. This is Hogwarts, Finn said, already walking forward to examine a bush covered in small blue flowers that seemed to pulse with their own gentle rhythm. Impossible is just where we start. Ivy had moved to the nearest flower bed and was kneeling beside a plant with broad leaves and bright orange blooms. She recognized it as a fire lily, a rare magical plant that usually only grew in volcanic soil. She reached out, not quite touching it, but close enough to feel the gentle warmth it radiated. This is her work, Ivy said softly. Helga Hufflepuff. I can feel it. This is her magic, still alive after all these centuries. She made this place for students who needed comfort, who needed to remember that life continues even in the coldest times. Marcus had walked to the fountain and was examining the water's strange behavior. The physics don't make sense, he said. But then, that's the point, isn't it? This isn't about logic, it's about something deeper. The three of them explored the garden slowly, taking their time, discovering its various sections and features. There was an area dedicated to herbs, another to flowering vines, a third to small fruit bearing trees that somehow had ripe fruit hanging from their branches, despite it being December. There were butterflies, impossibly, fluttering between blossoms. There were bees, moving slowly and peacefully, gathering nectar in the eternal spring of this enchanted space. Eventually, they found themselves drawn back to the fountain, where they sat together on one of the stone benches. The sound of the water was even more soothing up close, and they found themselves relaxing in ways they hadn't realized they needed. I understand now, Marcus said after a long silence, why this place only appears to those who need it. It's not about being sad or lonely or homesick, though those things might bring you here. It's about needing to remember something important. What's that? Finn asked. That beauty persists, that growth continues, that even when everything outside is cold and dark and difficult, there are places where life thrives. And if we can remember that, if we can carry that knowledge with us, then we can endure anything. Ivy nodded slowly. My grandmother used to say that gardening was an act of faith. You plant seeds not knowing for certain they'll grow. You tend plants through seasons of dormancy, trusting that they'll bloom again. You work with nature, not against it, and you learn patience. My mom says something similar about magic, Finn added, that it requires trust. You cast a spell and you have to believe it will work, even though you can't see the magic itself, only its effects. Faith and magic are intertwined. They sat quietly, absorbing the peace of the garden, feeling tensions they hadn't known they were carrying begin to ease. The winter outside seemed very far away, the pressures of classes and exams, and expectations muted by the gentle constancy of this growing place. After a while, Ivy stood and began to walk the paths again, examining plants more closely. Marcus pulled out a small notebook he always carried and began to sketch the fountain, trying to capture the impossible geometry of the water's movement. Finn found a book left on one of the reading tables, an old leather bound volume about magical gardens throughout history, and settled into a comfortable chair to read. Time moved strangely in the winter garden. It might have been 20 minutes or 2 hours before Ivy called out to her friends, excitement clear in her voice. Come look at this. Marcus and Finn joined her at the far end of the garden, where she was standing in front of a plant they hadn't noticed before. It was about 3 feet tall, with silvery bark and branches that curved gracefully upward. The leaves were a deep green that seemed almost black in the lamplight, and scattered among them were flowers unlike anything any of them had ever seen. The flowers were white, but they contained within them what appeared to be tiny constellations, as if someone had captured the night sky and pressed it into each petal. They glowed softly, not with ordinary light, but with something that looked like starlight, concentrated and contained. What is it? Marcos asked, leaning closer but careful not to touch. I think Ivy said slowly. It's a memory keeper. I've read about them but never seen one. They're incredibly rare, almost extinct. They absorb emotional energy from their surroundings and store it in their flowers. The constellations you're seeing, those are actually patterns of memory, of feelings that people have experienced near the plant. So, this plant has been collecting the feelings of every student who's ever found this garden? Finn asked, awed by the thought. For centuries, Ivy confirmed. Every person who needed comfort and found it here, every moment of peace, every realization of hope, all of it absorbed and preserved. This plant is a record of healing. Marcus stared at the flowers with new appreciation. That means we're part of it now. What we're feeling, the peace we're finding here tonight, it's being added to the pattern. We're contributing to something that will help students we'll never meet long after we're gone. The three of them stood silently, contemplating the weight and beauty of that realization. They were connected to every student who had come before them and every student who would come after, all of them seeking the same thing, all of them finding it in this impossible garden that Helga Hufflepuff had created out of love and wisdom and a deep understanding of what young people needed. Eventually, they made their way back to the fountain and sat together, this time in a companionable silence that didn't need to be filled with words. Each of them was lost in their own thoughts, their own reflections on what this place meant and what they had discovered about themselves by finding it. Ivy thought about her love of growing things, how it connected her to something larger than herself, how plants were patient teachers if you knew how to listen. She thought about her family's garden at home and realized that she didn't miss it as much as she thought she did. She carried it with her in her knowledge, in her care for living things, in her understanding of cycles and seasons. The physical place was just one expression of something she held inside herself. Marcos thought about patterns and connections, how everything in magic and in life was interconnected in ways that weren't always immediately obvious. He thought about his beloved bookshop at home and understood that what he really missed wasn't the place itself, but the feeling of being known, being seen, having his interests and passions recognized and encouraged. But he had that here too, he realized, in his house, with his fellow Ravenclaws who shared his love of learning, with Ivy and Finn, who saw him as more than just a brain, who valued his friendship for itself. Finn thought about home, about Ireland, about the particular way rain sounded on his bedroom window, and the smell of his mother's soda bread baking. He thought about how strange it had been to come to a new school, how hard he'd worked to fit in, to make friends, to prove himself, and he realized that he had succeeded, that Hogwarts was his home now too, that you could have more than one place where you belong. Home wasn't just a location, it was a feeling, and he carried it with him wherever he went. The fountain continued its musical burbling, the flowers continued their gentle glowing, the warmth continued to embrace them like a loving parent tucking a child into bed. The garden was doing what it had been created to do, offering sanctuary, providing comfort, reminding its visitors that they were stronger and more resilient than they sometimes felt. Eventually, though none of them wore watches in the garden and time seemed irrelevant there, they sensed that it was time to go. Not because they wanted to leave, but because they had received what they came for, whether they had known they were coming for it or not. They stood together and took one last look around, trying to memorize every detail, though somehow they all knew that the memory of this place would remain vivid long after ordinary memories had faded. This was magic after all, and magic had a way of making important moments permanent. Will we be able to find it again? Finn asked as they walked toward the door. I think so, Ivy said. Now that we know it's here, now that we've been welcomed once, the garden will remember us. It might not appear every time we look for it, but when we really need it, it will be here. Marcus nodded in agreement. That's how the castle works. It gives us what we need, not always what we want, but what we need. And now we know this place exists. We can hold on to that knowledge. Even when we can't physically be here, we can remember it, can draw strength from knowing it's here. They stepped through the door and back into the narrow corridor, and as the door swung shut behind them, they heard a soft sound, almost like a sigh, as if the garden itself was bidding them farewell. Until next time. The door became just another old wooden door, no different from dozens of others throughout the castle, except that they knew what lay beyond it. The corridor felt colder after the warmth of the garden, but not uncomfortably so. The snow was still falling outside the windows they passed, but somehow it seemed less bleak now, more beautiful, a necessary part of the cycle that would eventually lead to spring. They walked back through the castle together, retracing their steps, though the path seemed clearer now, as if the castle was gently guiding them toward their respective common rooms. They passed ghosts, who nodded to them with what might have been approval. They passed portraits whose subjects seemed to smile more warmly than usual. They passed windows that framed the snowy landscape like a series of beautiful paintings. When they reached the point where they would need to separate, each heading to their own house, they stood for a moment in a circle, looking at each other with a new appreciation. Thank you, Ivy said simply, for coming with me, for believing we could find it. Thank you for suggesting it, Marcus replied. I didn't realize how much I needed this tonight. We should go back, Finn said. Not right away, but sometime. And maybe we should tell others about it. Not everyone, but people who might need it. People who are struggling. The garden will decide who finds it, Ivy said. But yes, we can point people in the right direction. We can tell them to stay open, to trust the castle, to believe that help exists even when they can't see it. They said their goodnights and went their separate ways, each carrying the warmth of the garden within them like a candle flame sheltered from the wind. Ivy made her way to the Hufflepuff common room, where the fire was burning low, and most of her housemates had already gone to bed. She curled up in an armchair for a moment, not ready to sleep yet, wanting to hold on to the feeling of the garden a little longer. Marcus climbed the stairs to Ravenclaw Tower and solved the door's riddle with a distracted ease, his mind still full of impossible fountains and flowers made of starlight. His dormitory was quiet when he entered, his roommates already asleep. He changed into his pajamas and climbed into bed, but lay awake for a while, staring up at the ceiling and thinking about patterns and connections and the unexpected ways that magic provided exactly what was needed. Finn gave the fat lady the password and entered the Gryffindor common room to find it empty, except for a few fifth years cramming for a transfiguration test. He waved to them absently and made his way up to his dormitory, where he could still hear the soft sound of snow against the windows. He thought about his great aunt, about how she had found the garden when she was his age, how it had helped her through her homesickness. He understood now, in a way he hadn't before, why she had spoken of it with such love and gratitude. The three students fell asleep at roughly the same time in different parts of the castle, but all of them carried the same dreams. They dreamed of gardens that never froze, of flowers that held entire galaxies in their petals, of fountains that sang, and water that defied the laws of physics. They dreamed of warmth in the midst of winter, of hope in the midst of darkness, of the quiet assurance that life continues, always continues, no matter how cold the season. And in the winter garden itself, tucked away behind its old oak door in a corridor that most students never noticed, the plants continued their growing. The memory keeper absorbed the emotional echoes of three young people who had found their way to sanctuary, adding their patterns to the constellation of feelings it had collected over centuries. The fountain continued its impossible dance. The lamps burned with their steady, unchanging light, and the garden waited, patient and eternal, for the next students who would need its comfort. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the grounds in white, transforming Hogwarts into a winter wonderland. In the Forbidden Forest, Creatures settled into their dens and burrows, waiting out the cold season. On the frozen lake, the ice grew thicker, strong enough soon to hold the weight of students who would want to skate and play. In the castle itself, hundreds of students slept in their four-poster beds, dreaming their various dreams, each one safe and warm within these ancient walls. And somewhere in the castle, in a corridor that appeared only to those who truly needed to find it, a garden bloomed eternal, a gift from a founder who had understood that young people needed more than education. They needed hope, they needed comfort, they needed tangible reminders that beauty persists even in the darkest times. Helga Hufflepuff had been gone for nearly 1,000 years, but her love remained, living and growing in this enchanted space, offering sanctuary to generation after generation of students who needed to remember that winter always, always gives way to spring. In the days that followed their discovery, the three friends found themselves changed in subtle but important ways. Marcus was a little less rigid in his thinking, more willing to accept that some things couldn't be explained by logic alone. Evie felt more confident in her abilities, more trusting of her instincts about when plants and people needed care. Finn felt more at home, more secure in the knowledge that he belonged here as much as anyone else, that Hogwarts had claimed him as one of its own. They didn't speak much about the garden to others, not because it was a secret exactly, but because they understood that some experiences were sacred, that some magic worked best when it was discovered rather than described. But they did watch their classmates with new awareness, noticing when someone seemed to be struggling, when someone looked like they might benefit from knowing that help existed even if they couldn't see it yet. To a sixth year Slytherin who seemed crushed by the weight of her family's expectations, Marcus mentioned in passing that he'd heard stories about a place in the castle where the air was always warm and the flowers always bloom. He said he'd heard it appeared to people who needed to remember that growth was always possible. To a third year Hufflepuff who was homesick and counting the days until Christmas break, Ivy suggested that sometimes the castle had surprises for those who were open to receiving them. She said that if he went walking some evening, staying open and trusting, he might find something that would help. To a fifth year Gryffindor who was struggling with self doubt after a difficult Quidditch match, Finn mentioned his great aunt's story about finding a garden that had helped her through a hard time. He said the castle had a way of providing what students needed if they were willing to trust it. They never knew for certain if any of those students found the winter garden, but they noticed that each of them seemed a little lighter afterward, a little more hopeful, as if they had discovered or remembered something important. And that was enough. As Christmas approached and the castle was decorated with its usual magnificence, evergreen boughs and holly, and great glittering trees in every common room and in the great hall, the three friends found themselves drawn back to the garden one more time. They went together late one evening when most students were at a special holiday concert in the great hall. The garden welcomed them back as if they had never left. The plants seemed to recognize them, or perhaps that was just their imagination. But the flowers seemed brighter, the air seemed warmer, the fountain's song seemed more joyful. They spent an hour there, not talking much, just being present with each other, and with the growing things around them. Before they left, Ivy approached the memory keeper plant and spoke to it softly, too quietly for Marcus and Finn to hear. She thanked it for holding the feelings of so many students over so many years. She thanked it for being a witness to healing, for proving that hope was not just a feeling, but a force that could be stored and shared and multiplied. She thanked it for being part of Helga Hufflepuff's legacy, for showing that true wisdom lay in understanding what people needed and providing it with grace and generosity. The plant didn't respond, of course, not in any way that could be measured or observed. But Ivy felt something shift, a sense of acknowledgement, of connection, of being part of something much larger than herself. And when she turned back to her friends, they saw something in her face that made them understand that she had experienced something profound, even if she couldn't quite put it into words. They left the garden hand in hand, the three of them linked together, walking back through the castle as snow continued to fall outside, as the Christmas decorations sparkled in the torchlight, as the castle hummed with the particular magic of the holiday season. They were different than they had been before finding the garden, changed in ways both obvious and subtle, carrying within them the knowledge that they were loved and supported and held by something larger than themselves. The castle loved them. The magic that flowed through every stone and portrait and suit of armor loved them. Helga Hufflepuff, long dead but still present in the spaces she had created, loved them, and they loved each other. This unlikely trio from three different houses, brought together by chance and held together by choice, and the shared experience of discovering something wonderful. As they separated to return to their respective common rooms, each of them made a silent promise to remember this feeling, to hold on to it through whatever difficulties lay ahead, to trust that even in the coldest, darkest times, there was always a garden somewhere, blooming eternal, waiting to offer comfort to those who needed it most. And they knew that they would carry this with them long after they left Hogwarts, long after they had graduated and moved on to adult lives and adult responsibilities. They would remember the winter garden and what it had taught them. They would remember that beauty persists, that growth continues, that hope is not just a feeling but a force, as real and powerful as any spell. Years later, when they were adults with jobs and homes, and perhaps children of their own, they would still dream sometimes of that garden. They would wake with the scent of flowers in their nostrils and the sound of an impossible fountain in their ears. And they would smile, remembering their younger selves, remembering the magic of Hogwarts, remembering that once upon a time they had been blessed with the gift of sanctuary when they needed it most. And if their own children attended Hogwarts someday, they would tell them